beautiful music, a sense of being part of community, an uplifting, positive hope for the meaning of life. This is worship. So stay tuned for Reach Out and Live. Welcome to Reach Out and Live, a program of music, scripture, and sermon, brought to you each week by the many viewers and members of First-Plymouth Church, Lincoln, Nebraska. Hi, my name's Jim, minister here at First-Plymouth. Now, today we're in that beautiful Bible story of on the road to Emmaus. We have our choir, the congregation is gathered, and our preacher is our minister, Juan Huertas. Let's join them. We are in Eastertide, my friends, and so each week we are reading moments in our scriptures where the risen Christ appears. Today we're at the end of Luke, where, do you remember, as two disciples were walking on the road to Emmaus, Jesus came alongside them and they did not know who he was. But then this happens. Listen. They urged him strongly, saying, "Come stay with us, because it's almost nighttime, and the day is nearly over." So Jesus went in to stay with them. When he was at table with them, he took bread, blessed it, and broke it, and gave it to them. Right then, their eyes were opened, and they suddenly recognized who he was, and then he vanished from their sight. They said to each other, "Oh, were not our hearts burning within us when he was talking to us on the road, when he was teaching us the scriptures?" Well, that same hour, they got up and they returned to Jerusalem, and they found the 11 and their companions all gathered together. And they were saying, "The Lord has risen indeed, and he has appeared to Simon." Then they told the other disciples what had happened to them on the road and how Jesus had been made known to them in the breaking of the bread.
Michael Pollan, in his book Omnivore's Dilemma, gives us a picture of 4 meals. The first meal is what he calls the industrial meal, and it's a meal that we're deeply familiar with. It's a meal that's based upon big agribusiness. This is the meal that we're most familiar with by fast food. Now, most of us, Americans, don't like to admit to this, but we eat a lot of fast food. And so that meal has high sugar, a lot of corn in it, and that meal feels really good at first, but long term it's really not best for our bodies. That's the first meal. The second meal is what he calls big box organic, which it's like Whole Foods. Now we love to go to those big box organic places, and we love to peruse the produce section, and we love to buy organic produce, and then we love to let it rot in our refrigerators. But boy, isn't it healthy to have those in our fridge? And that's better certainly, than the fast food, but still not great if we don't eat it. The third food is what he calls the pastoral type of meal. It has nothing to do with pastors in some ways. It's that food that we go to the farmer's market to get. We might go to a local ranch to get the meat butchered there. We might go to the farmer's market and peruse the produce section from these small farmers. That kind of food requires not just more attentiveness and intentionality, but then we buy it, and often because the price point it's a little larger, Americans do tend to actually cook more when they make that kind of investment in that food. The last kind of food is something that we would not familiar with, but our ancestors were. It's the hunter and gatherer type of meal, which means that we go into the plains or into the forest and we do what our ancestors did. We hunt and we gather, which means that we're hunting and gathering that which we can find, whatever's there in that particular season, nuts and berries and wild animals, that meal. Now, that meal does get us closer to our ancestors, but actually these days it wouldn't be easy for us to go back to hunting and gathering. Well, this is not a sermon about types of meals, but what I found most intriguing about his treatment of this topic is that after giving us this beautiful picture, he's inviting us to take meals seriously. Because there's something powerful about sharing a meal. Something that goes much more than merely feeding our bodies or getting the nutrition that we need. Community matters. And how we gather together around the dinner table tells us a lot about what it means to be human. In some ways, it's a primal instinct to gather in such a way. You know this, and I know this too. It's just that it's harder in practice. It was even harder for me as a pastor. So a few years ago, we too were in that kind of type of life that was very busy all the time, and we too were going by the drive-thru a little bit too many times during the week. We were also sitting with rotten vegetables in our refrigerator, but then something happened. It was the spring of 2020, and all of a sudden we find ourselves at home for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. We also find ourselves in a situation where the restaurants around us had closed, and some were doing takeout, but the takeout was way too expensive for a family of 5. So we found ourselves going to the grocery store once a week and cooking a lot more at home. In fact, we were cooking at home every day during those weeks of pandemicking. And pretty quickly, we, the 5 of us, were sitting around our table, eating together, sharing stories together, talking more. Now, I'm not going to sentimentalize this activity. You and I both know that when we share a table together, it can also get a little difficult. You know, after a few weeks of beauty and family, we were ready to murder each other. I didn't think I would miss the office that much. And yet, we were still at it. We were still gathering and eating together. Something powerful happens there, especially during gritty times. Something else happened in that summer. If you remember, May, June of that year, a lot of the anxieties and the fears of a whole nation bubbled up to the surface. A lot of some of the racial kind of tensions that have been there from the beginning of time rose to the surface. And all of a sudden, the differences that we had out for one another began to put a pressure on us, and things began to look really, really difficult all around us. And many of us were wondering, what are we going to do? And so we began to see something emerging later that fall into early 2021 that was actually quite interesting. In fact, some of my colleagues in other parts of the country began to gather around table with people unlike them to have difficult conversations together. In other words, the meal becoming a place of healing, of forgiveness, of conversation. Now, what seemed novel during that difficult time is actually not novel at all. And it's true, sometimes in the middle of difficulty, that we think of ideas that are actually quite ancient ideas. We think it's novel. But it is not novel. In fact, this week as I was getting ready for the sermon, I found a little bit of writing from philosopher Immanuel Kant. He wrote in the late 1700s, and he was deeply interested in what it meant to be human. So he wrote a little treatise, actually a series of writings that came to be known as Anthropology in a Pragmatic Point of View, was the name of the writing. And he's writing about what it means to be human and what it means to be human with other humans and all this kind of philosophical kind of discussion that's quite interesting and also at times quite boring, to be honest with you. But in the middle of his treatise, he actually talks to us about the power of meals to bring people together across difference. Now, as he's writing, he's thinking about how people can have intellectual conversations across difference around meals, right? And so he's encouraging people to do just that. And he has 10 guidelines to help folks who want to come together in this way, to help them have an effective intellectual conversation across difference. Now, I'm going to kind of tell you about the 10. You can go on Google and find them. But there's about 3 of them that really catch my attention. One of them, he says, is that there is a size to the group that matters. And that actually on the larger side creates more conversation that's generative. Because you have more diversity, more difference, creates better conversations. The second thing that grabbed my attention about his list is that he talks about that there's going to be a time in the conversation where you want to make sure that everyone's being heard, right? That there's not somebody that's really like dominating the conversation. And we all have been at dinner parties where someone dominates conversation. The other is because there's such a large group that he says, whatever happens at that dinner stays at that dinner. He's like, whatever happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. Because he says trust is important if you're going to have conversation across difference. The last thing that caught my attention is he says, there's going to come a point in the conversation where our emotions are going to get heated. Because, again, you have a lot of people exchanging ideas. He says, so this actually fascinated me about a philosopher. He says, he didn't say turn to reason. He says, turn to humor. Turn to humor. And use humor and wit to soften the space a bit. Because after all, isn't it good to kind of laugh at one another? There's a little humbling aspect to that kind of movement in our life together. So we shouldn't be surprised then that in today's scripture, these 2 people are going on a journey to Emmaus. They have experienced the risen Lord, but they also experienced the crucifixion. So they are having this conversation together, right? Can you believe what happened? And then this stranger comes alongside them, and he says, what are y'all talking about? And the 2 disciples are baffled. Haven't you heard about Jesus of Nazareth who was tried and crucified and he rose again? And the stranger says, no, tell me more about that. So they have a conversation together all the way to their destination. And then when they get there, they invite this stranger to dinner with them to continue the conversation. And all of a sudden, these disciples who are hosting this stranger, they themselves becomes the one who are hosted by this stranger. And everything changes in that very moment. From the very beginning, our faith has been one rooted on table and meal fellowship. Oh, we have this table that centers our space, and that reminds us that for sure Jesus promised us that Jesus will be present each time we gather around this table. But the truth is that the story of faith from the very beginning, from ancient Israel, it has been about meals and meal sharing. You can think about manna in the wilderness, for example, or quails that rain down from heaven. You can think about the psalmist who says that God sets a table before him in the presence of his enemies. You can think about a prophet who sees a basket of fresh spring fruit coming before him. You can think about Jesus, who over and over again gathered people and ate with them. This Christ even took little and made a lot out of it to feed everyone. So he got me thinking, if meals are pivotal to our life together, and meals are important, especially in a season of difficulty, so that we can have conversation across difference. If meals are that thing which nourish us, not just our bodies, but our spirits and our minds, then what does it look like for us to lean on that way of being in the world? What does it look like for us to be truly a meal fellowship? What does it look like for us to gather around table together? Because most Americans gather around table together, but they gather around table with people just like them. So what does it look like for us to gather with people that are not like us? And then I thought about this gathering. We coming together on the Lord's Day. And how we are coming from different places. And yes, some of you might come for the beautiful music and the sermon, maybe. But I think you really come here for the cookies and the coffee. I think you come here for the fellowship and the catching up with one another. I think there's something already quite magical happening here among us. But what does it then look like for us to take this little moment of magic and extend it into the everyday life of First-Plymouth Church? What would that look like? And that's when a beautiful song came to mind from singer-songwriter Brandy Carlisle. And she says, I want a house with a crowded table, a place by the fire for everyone. Oh, a crowded table. Now, I think First-Plymouthers are about this thing. We are about a crowded table. We are about a place by the fire for everyone. Don't we say that every time we enter into worship? We say, whoever you are and wherever you are on the journey, you're welcome here. Don't I remind you so often, too, that it's not just that we put up with you here or tolerate you here. Oh, no. We celebrate you here. We're glad you're here. In fact, there is some incompleteness in us when you're not here. A crowded table. Yes, that's who we are. But then I got to thinking. Now, a crowded table is uncomfortable at times. You don't have this. Just a few weeks ago, Jim and I walked around the hallway here, center aisle, and pushed you to the side so you could fit somebody else. We said, oh, excuse me, would you move over just a little bit? And you're like, oh, goodness, I'm already almost on the lap of my neighbor here. How much tighter can I get in this pew? A crowded table means that we're going to have to learn to live together in good days and in bad days, in agreement and in disagreement. Oh, a crowded table. Could it be, First-Plymouth, that that's who we are called to be into the future? What would it look like for us to be table setters, meal keepers? What would it look like for us to walk out these doors week after week and extend this crowded table into the world? I have a hunch that if we do just that, we're not just going to continue the crazy and exciting and radical ministry of Jesus into the world, which that's amazing and awesome, and we should. But if we practice this crowded table, what happens is that we too are transformed. We too are renewed. We too have encounters. All of a sudden, we find ourselves saying, weren't our hearts burning? Weren't our hearts burning? This gathering, this messiness, this complication, this grit, this difference, this way of being in the world, could it be that we see Christ in the breaking of the bread?
It is wonderful that we could worship together. I hope it has brought you some peace and hope. Do you know you could join our worship services live every Sunday at 9 and 10:30 on Facebook, YouTube, or our website, and all of that is made possible by gifts from friends like you.
If you believe that an open-minded, loving congregation can help change the world, then consider making a donation. It will help us increase the love of God and neighbor, both in Nebraska and the world. If you would like to learn more about our church, go to firstplymouth.org. You can watch videos of the sermons, learn about our many programs and missions, then follow us to Facebook and become a friend. We now worship online at 9 a.m. and 10:30 on YouTube, Facebook, Vimeo, and our website. We also add live events, so join us online. At the end of almost every worship service is a call to action, where you are asked to go forth and not just believe in the Christ, but be the Christ in our world, to bring love to others. So do so. Let's reach out and live.
Tune in again next week for another edition of Reach Out and Live.